Yo, what's up everyone? Welcome to Small World and thank you for joining me with today's video. In this episode, I'm going to show you how to make a realistic abandoned World War II bunker diorama in 1/24th scale. This build was super fun and easy to make, and I'm very pleased with the final result. During this video, I'll show you how to make the bunker walls starting with the pink XPS foam, how to add a realistic concrete texture, how to weather the concrete with inks, acrylic paints, and sandpaper, how to paint and weather old rusty doors, how to cast and paint plaster rocks, and much more. Let's get started. First, I'm cutting out the walls of the observation bunker with my hot wire cutter, and I'm cutting these edges at a 45-degree angle so that each wall lines up perfectly at the corners. This bunker is a 5-inch square and is roughly 8 inches tall. I use a cardboard template to cut out the shape of the observation slit on both sides of the bunker. Here are all the pieces. The back doesn't go down all the way as it'll be glued to a staircase that's behind it. Assembly is pretty straightforward. I just used some foam safe super glue and along with some matte Mod Podge, and I joined the pieces together at the corners. Also, in case anyone is wondering, this observation bunker is based off of a real life bunker. I know it closely resembles the one from Saving Private Ryan, but this is based off a much smaller coastal defense fort that's local to me in the United States. In fact, this whole diorama is inspired by these forts, but all of these techniques can be applied to any concrete structure. I fill any gaps at the seams by using spackle. These repairs don't need to be perfect as any minor defects will be filled with the concrete texture later on. Here's how the observation bunker looks when it's assembled. Moving on, I'm cutting out strips of foam that are 1.5 inches wide, and then I cut it to have a thickness of 3/8 of an inch. I'll use these strips to make my staircase, and each step will be 3/8 of an inch tall and have a run of 1/2 of an inch. I plan on gluing these strips on top of each other, so all I need to do is make sure that each piece I glue on top of one another is 1/2 inch shorter than the piece below it. This will make more sense later on. Here you can see all of the strips for my staircase cut out, and each piece is 1/2 inch shorter than the last. Again, I glue the foam with foam safe super glue and white glue, and I start to stack each piece on top of one another by lining up the backs of each piece. I simply just repeat this step until I've glued the entire staircase together. Once all the pieces are stacked on top of each other, I glue a foam wall along the right side. And here's the finished staircase. Now I'm going to be cutting out some holes for doors. To do this, I again made a couple templates from chipboard. I start by lining up the template where I want my door to be, and then I tape it in place using artist tape. Then, I mark the edges of the door along the bottom of the foam, flip it over, and then line up the second template on the other side of the wall. Using the cardboard as a guide, I take it over to the hot wire cutter and run the wire against the templates. The wire won't cut through the board and it'll leave you with a 90-degree cut. I repeat this process for several other doors. If the wire leaves a couple jagged marks in the foam, they can easily be filled with spackle. Here, I'm cutting out a large opening for a double door using the same method. If you don't have a hot wire cutter, you can cut out all of these pieces using a craft blade. It'll take a little bit longer and sanding will be required to get precise results. Now, I'm beginning to assemble other wall sections again using the same glues as before. I fill any gaps with spackle and I continue along with assembling the walls. Once all the walls are assembled, I paint the pink foam with a coat of black paint. This coat doesn't need to be perfect, just do your best to cover up as much pink as you can. I'm using some cheap acrylic craft paint to do this. I should have done this part before the paint, but I wanted to add a couple spots where the concrete is chipped away along the edges, so I just dig out some foam chunks with my X-Acto knife. Then, I go back and cover up any exposed pink foam with more black paint. To add additional texture, I glue on some fine sand to the chipped areas. For the concrete texture, I use quick setting mortar mix and I put it in a cup and put a stocking over the top to sieve out any large out of scale rocks from the mix. Then, I brush on some matte Mod Podge onto the foam wall and then shake the fine mortar mix on top of the glue. Next, I make sure to remove any excess mortar and then I soak the dry mix with isopropyl alcohol. Then, I add some diluted matte Mod Podge on top and then work it into the surface with a foam brush. I then repeat this process for all of the other walls. I've tried other ways of applying the mix, such as actually mixing the mortar with water and applying it as a paste, but it ended up flaking off all of the walls on my test pieces. I think that applying it dry on top of the glue and then soaking it with more glue really helps lock it down properly to the wall. Once dry, I sand the pieces using some 220 grit sandpaper to knock down any rough, out of scale texture. Whenever working with mortar mix, always make sure to wear a respirator and gloves. I didn't wear gloves at first, and even though it didn't bother my skin, it's always a good idea to be on the safe side and wear them just in case, so I ended up putting some on. Just make sure that you read all of the safety precautions that you should take before working with the mortar mix. Here, I'm applying the mix to the observation bunker using the same methods as before. The only thing I had to keep in mind was that each side had to dry fully before moving on to the next. This took some time, but it was well worth it. You could always just texture the foam directly and paint it to look like concrete, which I actually have a tutorial for if you want to see it. But for this project, I really wanted to emulate the old worn down concrete look, and I thought it would be cool to have the little specks of real rock showing through on the surface. The mortar mix has lots of ultra fine pebbles, and it gives a really nice finish that's to scale when you sift it with the stocking. Like I mentioned earlier, these are US made bunkers and they were made during the 1890s throughout the early 1900s. None of the bunkers today show any markings indicating that they were board formed concrete like you would see on a typical German bunker. It's more likely that they used larger sheets of wood for pouring the concrete into, resulting in little to no construction marks on the surface. I just thought I'd let you know the reason for not adding that specific texture. Again, I sand all the rough spots down once all the walls are dry using some 220 grit sandpaper. The concrete is way too bright as it is, so I darken the surface using diluted India ink. I learned this technique from one of Nightshift's recent videos, and I absolutely love the way that it turned out. I'll leave a link to his channel below. Inks flow very efficiently over textured surfaces, and they do a great job of highlighting subtle details. I didn't specifically measure any ratios when thinning the ink with water, I just did a couple of sample pieces until I was happy with the result. Note here though that the ink will dry much lighter than it looks when it's being applied. The mortar is a very porous surface and the ink soaks right into it, so rather than just sitting on top, the ink will absorb into the mortar and it will dry a lighter shade. Again, this is a really good reason to do some test pieces first. You can speed up the drying process by using a hairdryer, and that should let you know pretty quickly what the final shade will look like. I guess it's better to start off lighter, meaning using a more diluted mix of ink, and you can always add more layers to the surface to get a darker shade. However, it can be much more difficult to lighten the wall if it's too dark. Once the wall is dry, I again sand it with 220 grit sandpaper. This will break up the surface, making it look more aged and textured as it exposes some light spots beneath the ink wash. I also thought it would be fun to add some cracks around these holes that I dug out of the foam earlier. I just scored and scraped away using my X-Acto blade to make the cracks into the concrete. I used more layers of ink to indicate parts of the concrete that were wet. This observation bunker will be embedded in a hillside, so I used the ink as a general guide for what the slope of the hill would look like around the bunker. I used some acrylic raw sienna washes to imitate this yellowy moss that I found on a lot of real-life bunkers. Again, because the surface absorbs whatever you put on it, the water from the wash makes the concrete look temporarily darker. Once the water from the wash dries, it'll lighten up and only leave down the raw sienna paint. Then, I just continued around the bunker with more ink washes. I also thought it would be fun to simulate the damp concrete by applying gloss varnish over the darker areas. I'm using UVLS Gloss Clear Varnish by Createx, which is a water-based varnish. It has kind of a bluish white color to it, but it dries clear and glossy. The finish won't be super shiny. Once it dries, it'll leave a nice sheen that looks just like wet concrete. I glued the left side of the staircase onto one of the wall pieces using the same glues as before. Then, I darken the steps using more ink and gloss varnish. This is how everything looks so far. Nothing's glued down to the base at the moment, just resting in place. It's amazing what a couple of washes of ink along with some sanding can do to make an aged concrete finish. But my real life references had some pretty weathered walls that I wanted to try and replicate. For the staircase piece, I added some streaking effects using diluted ink, as well as undiluted ink. As you could imagine, the undiluted full-strength ink was completely black, and I was definitely worried that I'd ruin the wall by overdoing the weathering. But I decided to stick with it because my references showed really dark concrete walls on some bunkers. In fact, some of my pictures showed concrete walls that were completely black from moisture and mold. I wasn't bold enough to do a full wall, but in the end, I was happy by the way that these effects turned out. Again, I know it can be nerve-wracking to do these bold effects, but it helps to the fact that the inks dry a lighter shade after absorbing into the mortar, and they also do a really good job of blending themselves out. I added some more cracks using my X-Acto blade along the staircase wall. Then, I applied some more staining with the raw sienna acrylic paints. I do the same process for the wall that butts up to the staircase wall, and again, I'm being very generous with the inks, building up multiple layers over time, sanding between coats, and checking my references to make sure I'm heading the right direction. The sponge can help break up the surface and add more random texture along the wall. Once all the inks dried, I speckled some diluted white acrylic paint over all of the walls. I love the effect that this gives, and I think it really helps add even more realism to the concrete surface. Also, I painted the inside of the observation bunker a two-tone white and dark green with acrylic paints. I couldn't film the process due to the tight spacing though. I 3D modeled and printed some doors using my Elegoo Saturn 3D printer. If you'd like to download and print these files on your own 3D printer, my files are available on my Patreon for Gold and Platinum members. Anyways, I primed these doors along with a few 55-gallon drum barrels that I also modeled and printed with a dark brown mahogany primer. And now I'm airbrushing a rusty red color on top in a random overlapping pattern. I'm going to be chipping paint on top of this, again a technique that I learned from Night Shift. Once the red is applied, I spray Vallejo chipping medium over top. Don't worry about the really rough texture as it's going on, it'll dry completely flat. I mix up a green color using Tamiya acrylics and I cover a few of the doors with it using my airbrush. The coverage can be a little patchy, and I do my best to make sure that I apply a really thin coat. I then go back and apply another thin coat of a lighter shade of the same green. I just mixed a little more white into the previous shade. Again, I just apply it in a random, irregular pattern. I painted two other doors black as some of my references showed both black and green doors. The barrels were base coated with olive drab by Tamiya. I brush painted a couple of the hinges and brackets white on some of the green doors to add some more variation and interest to them. Then, using a wet stiff brush, I start scrubbing the surface, which activates the chipping medium below the green paint. Pretty soon, after agitating the surface enough, the green paint will begin to peel off in fine flakes, revealing the rusty finish below, which leaves a really convincing chipped finish. This technique is super fun and satisfying to do. I've done chipping using masking fluid as well as brush painting on chips, but this method is super quick and easy, especially if you want random natural chipping. To make the green paint look more faded and oxidized, I mixed a light, pale shade of green using acrylic paint and watered it down quite a bit. Then, I just scrubbed it on all over the surface. I know it looks really messy and bad as I'm putting it on, but it dries to a much more subtle and convincing faded finish. I do the same for the black doors, but using a dark bluish gray color rather than the pale green. The green doors get a pin wash using Tamiya enamel wash, and this helps sharpen all the details like the bolts and the hinges, making them pop and stand out more. Then, I go over the chips with some AK Interactive enamel rust washes, using both the light rust wash and the streaking rust wash. I simply just brush them on near some of the chips, and then I blend them into the surface with some enamel thinner to get the subtle staining and smooth transitions between chips and green paint. Unfortunately, I lost the footage of me adding the rust washes to the black doors. I essentially just applied them like the black Tamiya pin wash to the green doors, highlighting the bolts and the hinge details. I 3D printed a small vent, painted it gray, and then rusted it with the same enamel washes. Then, I cut a small hole in one of the foam walls, painted the exposed foam black, and then glued the rusty vent in place with super glue. Once installed, I added some more light rust tones onto the vent, and then added a rust streak below it onto the concrete wall. The doors just slid into place where I cut out the holes in the wall, and I fixed them in place with super glue from the backside. The door to the observation bunker is glued in place swung open, so I just glued it to the left side of the wall using super glue. The barrels were chipped using the same method of scrubbing the paint with a wet brush, and then I applied the light enamel rust wash in a downward streaking motion with the brush. This is how they turned out. This is how all of the wall sections look with the doors glued in place and the walls all painted up and weathered. By this point, I was super happy with the way things were coming together. Now it's time to start gluing the model to a wooden base. I make the sides of the diorama using foamed PVC board, and I cut the left and right sides to fit the contour of the terrain that I'm going to model. I sanded the edge of the PVC board so that the concrete wall sits up flush against it, and I glued the concrete wall in place with some super glue and white glue. I glued the observation bunker in place, blocking the whole screen while doing so, and then I slide a concrete pad that butts up against the staircase, as well as a wall that sits on top of it. The left PVC piece sits flush with the concrete wall, and I glue the two remaining PVC strips along the front and back of the base. I wanted to add some rock faces on the hillside that I'm going to add along the observation bunker. I've had these Woodland Scenics rock molds for years, and I haven't used them for nearly a decade, so I thought it would be fun to try them out again. I poured in some plaster of Paris that I mixed with water and matte Mod Podge. I found it to be much more durable than using the recommended lightweight Hydrocal. When I demold these rocks, I don't really care if they break. The rocks would be too large for my diorama as is, so I planned on breaking them into smaller pieces anyway. Being that these molds are a commercial product, I've seen these rocks being used on many dioramas and layouts. Breaking them apart is also a good way of making sure that they look unique and not the same rock that you see everywhere else. I apply hot glue to the base, and I start blocking in the rough landform with XPS foam. This step doesn't have to be perfect by any means, and I'll show you how to fill gaps and round over sharp edges later on. I just continue to glue the pieces of foam until I'm happy with the overall shape of the landforms. At this point, I start to glue in the pieces of the plaster rock castings in place using some hot glue. I just randomly fit certain pieces together like a jigsaw puzzle, and I'll show you how to fill the gaps between them later on. You could also use plaster or white glue to glue the rocks in place, which would be stronger, but after the next few steps, these rocks will be firmly locked in place. At this point, the landform looks really rough, but that's okay. All of the irregularities will get filled with Sculptamold. I personally think that Sculptamold is one of the best terrain forming products since it's super easy and fun to work with and has minimal shrinkage. It also can dry really fast even if you mix a lot of water into it. Just leave a fan on it for a few hours and it should be good to go. It's really easy to blend the Sculptamold right up to the rock castings that we glued in earlier, and it makes them look as if they belong to the landscape. I also do the same to blend the edges of the bunker into the landscape as well. In the past, I've used other methods like paper mache and plaster bandages to cover up landforms that I made using newspaper and other filler materials. While that worked fine, I still find that using Sculptamold is less messy and leaves behind a nice rocky texture that is a great base for applying paint and earth effects. You can also smooth out the texture with some water and your fingers if it's too rough. It's not really a big deal for me, but I guess one con is that it can add a bit of weight to your project. I could have used less Sculptamold and made the project a little lighter if I was more precise when cutting and gluing the foam landform onto the base. Being precise in that step would mean less gaps and contours to fill with Sculptamold, but I honestly find the foam landscaping a little boring and I would rather just use more Sculptamold. I also add some Sculptamold along the back flat side of the diorama to create some uneven terrain and to blend the ground with the side edge of the diorama for a seamless finish. I mixed up some really thick plaster of Paris, and I'm using a silicone brush to smear in some of the plaster into the gaps that are left behind from piecing the several rock castings together. This allows the broken pieces to appear as a single rock face. Just take your time with this step, and any plaster on unwanted parts of the rock can easily be brushed away with some water. Here's how the diorama looks with all of the landforming finished. It really helps blend all of the elements together, and it's nice to have it run all the way to the edges of the base for a seamless finish. Next, I soak the plaster rocks to prep them for painting. Soaking them in water first will help the color washes flow over the surface better. Because I had some left over from all of the concrete weathering, I ended up using the same diluted ink to color the rocks. Like it did with the mortar, the ink soaked into the porous plaster surface on the rock castings, but it still did a nice job of highlighting all of the cracks and crevices on the surface. Again, I didn't measure any ratios of how much water I added to the ink, I just kinda went with what I thought looked pretty good at the time. Like before, the ink will dry much lighter, so you can always apply multiple layers of ink wash to get the desired shade that you're going for. I speckled the surfaces with some white paint like the concrete, and I added some more color variation using some acrylic burnt umber and sienna washes. The cool thing about rocks is they come in almost endless varieties of different colors. The rocks around here are typically pretty dark or kind of a tan, sandy looking color. I decided to go with the darker looking rocks since I think the colors would unify with the concrete surfaces across the diorama. And that's as simple as it gets for the rocks. It honestly took me like 5 or 10 minutes to paint them, and I think they turned out great. I paint the surrounding areas of Sculptamold using some dark brown acrylic craft paint. This is just to cover up all of the white surfaces in case I miss a spot when adding dirt later on. I use a large chip brush for painting the more open areas and a smaller paintbrush when I'm blending the paint up to the rock faces and around the bunkers. For the dirt itself, I use the same dirt method that I've been using on almost all of my dioramas. I take some dirt that I got from outside my house, I mix it with some water and matte Mod Podge, and then I apply it on top of the base. While the paste is still wet, I sprinkle more dry dirt and sand to add more texture and variation to the surface. Doing this also helps the paste dry quicker as the dry dirt soaks into the paste. The Mod Podge in the mix is what binds all of the dirt together, and it does a great job of sticking it to the surface. On the back side of the bunker, I really wanted to emulate more of a gravel path, so I used some fine sand and sprinkled it over top of the dirt. Some of the rocks in the sand were too large for the scale, so I removed them off camera. Then, I soaked the gravel in isopropyl alcohol and matte Mod Podge to lock everything in place. This is how it looked at this point, and the dirt texture and fine sand really helps tie all of the elements together. However, like with all my projects to this point, I find that the dirt that I use is a little too bright and reddish brown for the look that I'm going for. In the past, I've made dark brown washes using acrylic paints, but this time I used the more diluted ink wash, which also worked well. I just brushed the ink all over the dirt surfaces. What's nice about using diluted inks and acrylic washes for this step is that because the washes are diluted, all of the different color variations that you get from the sand are still visible, they're just a little darker. This is because a diluted wash doesn't cover everything equally like an opaque layer of thick paint. I darken the concrete pad using a mix of diluted ink and gloss varnish to give it a more damp look. In all of my reference images, the concrete on the ground was usually as dark or darker than the walls. Next, I start to make static grass tufts by applying some white glue onto some wax paper, and then I shook on some 4mm and 7mm static grass using my static grass applicator. Then, I shake off the excess grass and repeat this until I have enough tufts. Here's how they all turned out. Once they're dry, I just plant them individually using some more matte Mod Podge. I also plant some tan tufts of grass that I cut away from chip brush bristles. I used the bristles to make some really tall grass at the top of the bluff. All I did was snip off a piece of the brush, dip it in the glue, and then set it in place. Once all the tufts were glued down in place, I blended them to the surface using some 2mm static grass. First, I brushed on some Mod Podge, and then I applied the static grass again using my static grass applicator, and then I vacuumed up the excess with a stocking over the top so I could collect the loose grass. I repeat this process across the entire hillside until I'm happy with the coverage. Once all the grass is dry, I then start painting the grass using some brown Tamiya acrylic paints that I thinned a lot with some isopropyl alcohol. As I've mentioned in previous videos, I learned this technique from Boomer Diorama, and I'll link his channel in the description below. This is a super easy and quick method of really transforming the look of your project. The awesome thing is that you can paint the grass using any color that you want, so you basically have an endless variety of colors. Painting the grass means that you don't have to buy every single shade of static grass. You can just buy one color and paint it however you want. Now I'm applying more Mod Podge over the landscape to add some moss. I use Woodland Scenic's Burnt Grass Fine Turf for the moss, and I just sprinkle it all over the glue. After letting it sit a minute, I vacuum up the excess fine turf, and then I repeat these steps for anywhere that I want to add moss. I had a dirt patch along the back side of the bunker that looked a little bare, so I put down some more glue and added more static grass to it. Once the moss was glued in place, I painted the moss using some highly diluted acrylic paints. Again, another technique that I learned from Night Shift. Painting the moss is an awesome way to add realism within your project. I start by soaking it with this watered down yellow color. This is more or less a base layer for all of the other tones that I plan on adding on top of it. This step is super simple and easy, and you don't have to be precise when applying the paint, as any excess paint that gets on the surrounding areas will help blend the moss clumps into the environment around them. While the yellowish layer is still wet, I go back and add a more vibrant green tone over top. The diluted paints blend really well together. I know it looks terrible as I'm applying it, like some weird grainy slime or something, but it looks really realistic once it dries. Again, all we're doing is applying some green over the previous layer that we just painted on. I may leave a couple of the yellow moss patches alone to add some color variety on the surface. Once dry, the yellow patches look more like dying brownish moss. While the moss paint is drying, I add a couple bushes from Diorama Precipe. These bushes are some of my favorite scenery products because the fine leaves adds lots of detail. I applied this particular bush to represent vines on the wall next to the door. What's really cool about this specific product is that the leaves get finer and finer, just like real vines. I glue them in place using white glue and super glue. I glue another bush on the other side of the model, but this time it'll be more visible from the hillside part of the diorama. Once the moss had dried, I airbrushed it with a more vibrant green color. Lots of my references showed extremely bright green tones, and this was the easiest way to achieve that. Airbrushing the moss also helps bring out the surface texture much better than just the washes alone, as it highlights the most raised texture of the moss. After airbrushing the moss, I added some more brown tones to the grass patches that I added to the backside of the bunker. I use super trees from Scenic Express to add some bushes on top of the bluff, and I mainly just use super glue to hold them in place. The real forts have lots of these really dense, branchy looking dead patches of brush, and super trees do a good job of replicating that. All I did was give the super trees a light coat of brown primer, and then I ripped them up into smaller pieces before gluing them in place. The process is super easy, but gluing them down is just a little time consuming, but it's still fun nonetheless. I also noticed lots of random tall grass coming out of the ground by the doors, so I used these preserved plants that I purchased from the Scenic Factory over 10 years ago that I still have lying around. I glued my 55-gallon rusty barrels in place, and then I sprinkled on some blended up leaves to add more texture and color to the ground. I just brushed on some matte Mod Podge to lock them in place. This is how we're looking so far. Lastly, I wanted to make a small metal ladder, so I 3D printed the sides on my 3D printer, and then I cut the steps from styrene rod. I glued the rod pieces in place using super glue, and then I flipped it over and glued the other side to the rods to complete the ladder. I sprayed the ladder black, and then I glued it in place with super glue. Once in place, I quickly added some rust using some Streaking Rust Enamel Wash by AK. And with that, the model is finished. Overall, I'm very pleased with the final result. I know this is a bit of a different project than what I've done in the past, but it was super fun to try something new and make an old abandoned bunker. I took the model out to a local park and got these shots of the final result. I love how the sunlight looks on the model, and it was cool to have the bunker overlooking the water like it should be. Let me know what you think of this project in the comments below. I want to give a big thank you to all of my Patreon members. Thank you so much for supporting me and my work and for making videos like these possible. Your support really helps me cover the cost of materials for these projects and makes doing these videos affordable and worthwhile. I appreciate each and every one of you. Again, if you'd like to support me and my work, please consider joining my Patreon. If you join, you'll get to see work in progress pictures of my projects as I'm working on them, 3D print files from this project and previous projects, downloadable PDFs like scaled elevation drawings of some of my projects, behind the scenes Q&A videos, and much more. Well anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.